Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining this, our September 2018 Crisis Coach webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about creating a crisis communication roadmap. And I have to say, we had such great response to registration. One of the most well-attended sessions we've done this year, and I'm so glad because we have a great guest today, and I think you're going to get a ton out of this session. So if you joined because you really need to learn more about creating a crisis communication roadmap, you're in for a real treat, and I think you're going to learn some great information. Let's just cover the housekeeping for a moment. You can connect with us at any time on Twitter at Firestorm Soul, on Facebook at Firestorm Solutions, on our YouTube channel as Continuity Experts, and on LinkedIn at Firestorm Solutions as well. And anytime you have a question on social media, we have Instagram too, I forgot to throw that in here. So on any social media, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, etc., use the hashtag #CrisisCoach, and we will see your question and we will respond as quickly as possible. Speaking of questions, if you have one during this session, I don't know if we'll be able to get to it as a construct of timing today, but we will absolutely respond to you post-session. Additionally, we would like to do something a little different for this session because there are so many folks on the call. We're going to be producing a brief afterward. It'll be a 3 or 4 page summary of the key points that are made in this session, but we'd also like to include your questions and our answers to those. So during the webinar or after the session, excuse me, make note of your questions and please email them to webinars@firestorm.com, and they'll hit my desk, and I'll make sure that our guests today and I will respond to those for you, and we'll include those in that brief document. So the brief will have a facts section. We're going to break it into education and business, and hopefully all of your questions will be answered. And again, you can use the GoToWebinar console on the right-hand side to ask any question you'd like. We'll capture those as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please remember that this session is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion. Information given in this session should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion, and we appreciate you listening to that slide every time we have a session. Firestorm Services, you know us. We have crisis and risk solutions, a variety of professional services, including assessments, plans, training. People solutions, we can find you great talent, or if you are great talent, let us know. Our People Solutions division would like to talk to you. We have great security solutions. Former Secret Service folks are going to help make your spot safer, your employees safer, and teach you how to conduct a secure business environment. We have great intelligence solutions, and we can help you spot trends before they become crises. And analytical solutions providing comprehensive reports and analytic studies that lead the field in understanding the impacts of both crisis and how people in the business continuity field are responding and growing and maturing in their industry. Now, I'd like to introduce our special guest today is Dr. Kathie Fleck. Dr. Fleck is the Assistant Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Ohio Northern University, a beautiful little spot in the country. And Dr. Fleck has more than 25 years of experience in private business, politics, government, nonprofit, and even faith-based organizations, and higher education. In addition to teaching, she's the principal of her own consulting firm, KRF Consulting, working with clients in a wide range of industries. And her research interests, include crisis communication, political communication. And Dr. Fleck, we are very, very happy to have you with us today. And I would like to thank someone else on the call with us today, Candace Kaiser. Candace is, you may have read some information from Candace. She publishes quite often on our blog. She is our assistant editor for the Disaster Due Diligence newsletter, and she manages all of our content on our website. Candace studied with Dr. Fleck, and that is how we have matured this relationship. So thank you so much to both of you. And Kathie, I would like you to just jump on in because you wrote some articles for us. And one of them was called Netflix and the N-Word. And right after that, there was some other information that came out about other senior people in organizations. And I thought the timing was great, and your points were interesting. And just what were those points, Kathie?
So thank you, Karen. It's great to be on the call, and I'm pleased to be with everyone out there listening. The two pieces that I wrote on, and part of why I was compelled to write the pieces, is that in crisis communication planning, we typically don't consider our executives making missteps as something that we plan for. We plan for disasters, we plan for data security, but we're not often as concerned about the communication or missteps, however large or small, of our senior executives. And unfortunately, we are in a time frame where this seems to be a very pervasive and sort of ongoing issue for a lot of us, meaning that communication that we assumed was private can be disclosed, and even small communication or inadvertent or poorly choice of words, and then other sorts of personal proclivities that are very can be offensive, can be detrimental, and in many ways are now becoming very much exposed out in the public, not just on social media, but the traditional media and through a variety of communication methods, employee to employee, and so forth. And in these two cases, we had executives who were offensive at best, and this was exposed, and I could only imagine that it's unlikely that this was a planned for event by these organizations.
And that's the key, isn't it? Is it a planned for event? So we're going to talk a little bit today about how it can be a planned for event, and also something that I think is interesting that I'd like you to speak a little bit about is the CEO the person who is the spokesperson for the company? You know, if you have a small company, you may not have a PR arm or crisis communication arm, or any arm for that matter. So how do we make sure that the person who is going to be speaking is prepared? Do you have to speak at all? And what is the value of having predetermined crisis messages before you go in? We surveyed everyone before we started this session, and these are the results of that survey. And quite frankly, when I saw that my organization as a dedicated spokesperson is 78%, I thought that was very high. I was surprised at that number. And then I thought, well, maybe everybody's just thinking that someone is going to be the spokesperson, but they don't really know if that person's trained and ready. What do you think about that, Kathie?
I would agree, and I think that this concept needs a little bit unpacking too. So I think we do assume that we may have a director of communication, somebody who's in charge of marketing, somebody who typically talks to maybe the media, or who is our person who is out there, our face in the community, and we assume that it's either them or it is the president or CEO of the company. And while those two can be obvious choices as the spokesperson, they aren't always the choice, nor are they always the best choices. So there are two parts to that. One is you never want an organization to be with only one spokesperson, because you never know when that individual is not going to be on site in the case of an emergency that happens to your physical business location. I was at a big training not long after the Boston bombing when a hospital was rolling out the fact that all of their spokespersons were not on site to respond to the onslaught of communication and pressure and media inquiries And so somebody else had to take over that responsibility. So it's always best to have each individual crisis that you're planning for have a primary and a secondary spokesperson designated and properly trained so that those individuals can speak best to what is going on to the particular audiences and in the way in which you need them to speak. Karen posed the question whether or not we have to talk. We have to communicate, and that's true. Do we have to respond to the media? We do not necessarily have to respond directly to the media. There are any number of ways to communicate through public channels that we can communicate directly. You know, we have our own social channels. We have our own web-based platforms. We can get information out that can be consumed by the media, but do not necessarily need their own separate communication, which I think is a bit of a misnomer in the field. And then, of course, your slide here to the left about my organization has predetermined messages. One of the things that I tell my students when they're graduating and they go into whatever environment, if it's an agency, if it's a nonprofit, if it's a corporate environment, that they need to go look first thing at the crisis communication plan and see how well it's developed so that they can familiarize themselves with what needs to happen.
That is such a great comment. And what happens if they don't find one? You know, there's no better way to find a great role for yourself than to figure out where the empty space is and fill that space with something that's critical to an organization. And we need to talk about why we do this. You know, we do this, we have all ideas, you know, sort of vague ideas in our head, right, Kathie? We say, well, we do this because it's the right thing to do. We want to make sure that we're professional when we speak. But for us, message mapping and having this roadmap is your time machine. It allows you to buy time when you need it the most, because in the middle of a crisis, whatever the crisis may be, it may be here in South Carolina, the storm has taken a turn, it's going upstate, we weren't prepared for this. We need to close our schools and get some messaging out, and we do it in a way that's frantic and rushed, and we may miscommunicate, and miscommunication can put people's lives at risk at worst, and at best create confusion and certainly damage your leadership brand. So we really want to make sure that we're ready to go, and then support our organizations in making clear leadership decisions. That's what critical decision support is. That's what consultancies like Dr. Fleck, like Firestorm, that's what we do. We help you make clear decisions in times of crisis, A, because we've been through a lot of crises ourselves and have deep experience, but B, because you need objective, clear, and concise communication help when the crisis occurs. Confusion, as we know, costs time. So, Kathie, when you look at how do we even get started on this, or maybe we have some messaging created, but we haven't really done a lot of work on it. How would you describe message mapping, and how would you advise people take the next step?
So that's a great question. And from my experience, a lot of people, when planning for crisis in their communication binder or whatever their communication plan, crisis communication plan is the messages that are pre-created are generally created specifically for the media, with the express purpose of it going directly to the media. This concept of message mapping really is to help us think deeply and more strategically about all of the audiences that we need to communicate with, and not simply assuming that one message through the media is going to fit the needs of all of our particular audiences. So what it allows us to do is to think about the most likely events that we can plan for, because we are all smart enough now to know that it's not if we have a crisis, but when we have a crisis. And to think about what are the most likely opportunities and who are all of the stakeholders that we have that are going to expect direct communication from us. Who needs to be talked to, when they need to be talked to, in what manner, and on what platform. And that's what message mapping really allows us to do.
Oh, that was a great description of that, and I'm so glad we're going to be producing a brief at the end of this so we can capture exactly what you just said, because that was a really wonderful way to describe it. You know, I want to tell a story that if you've been on our webinars before, for those of you listening in, you've probably heard us talk about this, but I think it bears repeating, and it just goes to the basic facts of why we do message mapping and how leadership needs to be demonstrated through it. Our CEO on 911 was working in New York and brought all of their senior leadership team into the conference room, and they sat around the table and said, you know, how are we going to communicate to our employees? And Jim, our CEO, said, well, you know, we have to let people know they want to get to their families, they're concerned about their friends. If they want to leave, they should be able to leave. And we need to make sure they're safe as they do, but let's just let them know if they want to leave, they can leave. And he asked his human resource director to go back and craft a message and send out an all-employee notification, and she did. And she was devastated after that message went out, because what she had written in her rush to get the message out and her own fear, confusion, and stress, she wrote, if you want to live, leave. She was devastated. Not only was there this huge human tragedy unfolding in front of her, but then she felt that she had added to people's stress and confusion by the miscommunication. Now, we don't believe you're going to be able to craft every message for some catastrophic event, but it's having a clear understanding of the stress that people are under. No matter how professional or what level they are, lets us know that we at least need to think about these things before we move forward. Not only that, but we want to think about the why of what we're doing. You know, our CEO also says something to us, because based on his types of experiences, as I've just described. He wants us to ask why 5 times. Now, it may not be 5 times. It may be 20 times. It may be 3 times. But he wants you to ask why. Why are we communicating? Kathie, you have some great insights on this. What do you think about these points?
Yeah, I really do like this idea of asking why multiple times, because it forces us to think broader and more deeply about each one of our issues, the outcomes, the impacts, and the individuals that we are responsible for. And I think that oftentimes we don't do that, or we think we know, or we do it on sort of autopilot because we've been there, done that. But by forcing you to go through this exercise of justifying and thinking about, and maybe even doing some research on each one of these potential issues and the potential impacts and the individuals at the end of all of this communication, really is a strong responsibility that we bear, and one that we should take seriously in our planning.
You know, too, Kathie, one of the points that we make here, we really want you to start out by keeping your messages simple and short. Quite often, people will try to explain. It's like when someone writes a resume, they want to explain their whole life in this one-page document, and it's an impossible feat unless you have someone who really knows what they're doing to assist you. So we really want folks to keep their messages simple and short and clear and articulate. And the way we help you do that is we give you something that we use when we were on the ground at Virginia Tech. We needed to help the university come up with 3 key messages that were aligned with their core values and philosophies of the organization. And we said, first of all, we're not going to be defined by this event. You know, when we talk about the state flower of Colorado and what is it, no one ever knows. And the reason is because the state flower of Colorado will always be associated with the Columbine shooting, because it is the Columbine flower. So they will forever be defined by that event, as will the people who were involved in it, the people who were interviewed at the time. Every year on the anniversary, they'll have to revisit those messages and media. We also want to make sure that this not only doesn't define us, but that we will reinvent the future. We'll invent the future. So if there were challenges, if there were things we need to look at, we're going to look at those things and correct them, make them better, make them newer and fresher if that's what's required. And then we want to talk about how every crisis is a human crisis, and we are going to embrace anyone impacted by the event. Kathie, you had some insights on this as well to share.
Yeah, I think that we oftentimes identify crises, just as you said, by Columbine. We can use one word. If you say one word, even when I'm doing this exercise in class, if you say one word to an individual, it may be the location, it may be the company, it may be the city, we all know what you're talking about, and we go back to that crisis. And so you don't want to be defined by the event itself, even though the event will be associated with you. If you take on the persona of what happened and do not move beyond that, you can really doom your reputation and forever allow a stain to remain on your organization that's unnecessary. So we also know there are companies and there are things, crisis and locations where the tragedy happened, but that defined by their reinventing the future and how they came out of that tragedy, how they came out of that crisis and rebuilt their reputation. In doing so, that defined them in a brand new way. And so that goes to inventing, we will invent the future. And further, I think at every end, though, if we ever lose, and you'll probably hear me say this too many times on this webinar, but if we ever lose sight of the fact that at the end of every one of these crises is a human who is likely to be impacted in some way, then we will have done them and us a disservice. So constantly keeping in mind who is affected in the fact that we're going to, out of our corporate and organizational values, embrace them and do right by them as whatever that's defined, however that's defined. I think that will shape our communication and shape our decision-making in a very healthy way.
And I want to segue into this slide. I hope you see it on your screen. This is a sort of a message map template that we use here at Firestorm, and you can use any kind of a form that you like. This actually has a few more bits and pieces to it, but we couldn't fit them all on the screen. But you had, and we may show you a few others through this, and when you download the brief, we'll attach that to it. But Kathie, you had some good insights on this because we do ours just a little bit differently than maybe other folks do. So I'm going to show folks a couple of different examples while you're talking, but could you go ahead and talk to what this template looks like and how you start this exercise?
Well, what I like about this template is it puts the key questions up front. Before we start trying to develop our messages, which a lot of us jump to automatically because we know what should be said, it forces us to think through what is the issue, what is the impact, who does it impact, and then our communication strategy. And I think by putting it in that order, we put the appropriate weight on the impact and the individuals that are going to be impacted. And then, of course, then we work our way down. What are the messages? And then how are we going to communicate it on what platform, in what manner, on what time frame? And as we know that there are many different stakeholders, audiences, groups of individuals who can play a role in any particular crisis, and those move around. So if we're talking about something that's going to happen on your physical site, and that is someplace where you never have customers, then obviously your employees are going to be the most impacted. However, it's going to have an extended impact to your customers. If it is a place that you are a very public location where you've got all kinds of people coming in and out, then that's a very different level of stakeholders. It may be that your board of trustees are the third person on the list to communicate with. So it really allows you to visualize the decision-making process all in one place, and keep it all in one place so that you can compare and contrast and prioritize appropriately.
And you know, Kathie, I know something we talked about when we were preparing this session together. Years ago, I was in an industry where we assisted very large companies when they were downsizing, and there was always, they were very tense situations. They could at times become violent, and the media was always there. And people would leave the building after transition meetings, and cameras and microphones would be put in their faces. And for those transitioning, you know, you can ask them to, you know, speak as respectfully as possible, but that's not our responsibility anymore. But internally, one of the best things we can do for our own people who may be impacted by an event and may be approached by media, and today they will be approached by media via their Twitter account or their Facebook account. Hi, I'm a producer at Fox News, at CNN. We'd like to talk to you about such and such. Would you be available for an on-camera interview? You know, that makes everybody stop for a second. Can you tell me, Kathie, in your words, what the appropriate response to that should be?
Yes, everybody's organization from the top to the bottom, as part of their onboarding training and as part of their ongoing professional development, need to know where to direct those calls. It is our company policy that I direct you to our communications director. This is their name. This is their information. I can transfer you. Here's their email address, whatever it might be. That allows employees to be responsive to the media. At the same time, gets them off the hook for feeling like they have to answer questions from the media. There will be those employees who will want to say more, either because they just want to be helpful or because that's their nature. But what it does is it protects both them from legal liability, for personal liability, and it also protects your brand. And so the strategy of directing and funneling calls and inquiries through a designated person is obviously something that we need to continue to train to and push down to the very lowest level of the organization.
And folks on this call, one of the messages in your message maps is just that, so that your employees understand. It is, you know, it is our policy not to comment on this, or however you may word that. You have to give folks the words. I'll be more than happy to take your contact information and pass it on to the person who can respond more completely to your inquiry. If we don't give people the language, we can't blame them for not using it. So, Kathie, I would like you to speak to this whole concept of, well, how do we identify who we're speaking to, who we're speaking to first? Is it always the same? And then how we start talking about the messages and the why we're giving people the messages.
So, as I think I mentioned earlier, you have knowable and reasonable events that can happen in your sphere. So, while it would be awesome to be able to plan for every potential event that could happen, we need to at least plan for those that are most likely and most reasonably likely to happen. And so using a format like this, or some of the other formats that we're showing you, allows us to prioritize. So what is the most likely thing that could happen? I, as Karen mentioned earlier, I work at a small university carved out of the middle of a cornfield, and the location in which I teach is very vulnerable to regular weather events. So high winds, significant snow events, significant rain events, and tornadoes. And so that is something that we can know and plan for. And so who are those folks who are going to be the most impacted by this event that we're contemplating? That's the order in which you need to work. You work from the most impacted individuals, prioritize that communication, and then move backwards. So while in maybe an elementary school, you're going to worry about parents, and you're going to communicate very differently with the young ones. At a college situation, you're going to communicate directly with the students, and you're going to worry about the parents later. In your business, you may be worrying about your customers first and your employees later, or vice versa. So the person who is the closest and the most impacted directly by that particular event gets the priority of planning, and we move forward from there.
And there's really a very clear reason why we do this. We could talk, Kathie, about the bottom line. How do you help save the company from potential litigation? But that all pales in comparison to the true measure of what our communication means, and that is that words matter. Words are important. And you have a story that I think helps bring this point back very clearly for our audience.
So when I was a fairly new graduate and was working out in state government, I watched a tragedy unfold in my state where a large prison system in a rural area had a prison riot. And this riot was one of the largest and one of the most deadly in the country even to date. It happened over a number of different events, and things led up to it, and it happened over a holiday weekend. So at the end of the day, prisoners were killed, and then prisoners took a number of guards hostage. And this standoff happened for quite some time. In the process, there was intense pressure from parties all over the place, national parties. We had the FBI involved. This was going on at the exact same time that Waco was happening, if you recall that incident. And so there was intense media pressure and personal pressure. There was a small community that everybody knew the guards involved and all of the families, and they needed people to constantly talk. Well, we had some junior as well as senior individuals who were the designated spokespersons for getting information out to the media. At some point in time during this standoff, the inmates were putting information out, and the other parts of the prison were continuing to operate, and so the information would flow in a variety of ways. And so there's information out there that the guards were threatening the inmates were threatening to kill a guard, one of their hostages, if their demands were not taken more seriously. And in responding to an inquiry from the media about this threat, a spokesperson said that this was just the language of negotiations. This is just what the inmates are saying in order to get us to come to the negotiating table. Now, whether she was told that, whether that was something that just seemed like a natural response, it was used by the inmates who are monitoring the media by radio and other means as a reason for them and justification for them to murder one of their guard hostages, which they did. And they specifically blamed her comments as the reason for that murder.
And that just it's tragic. It's just a tragic and compelling reinforcement of why it's so critical that we think about what we're saying before we say it. And for those who are charged with speaking on behalf of our organizations, that they do so and stick to the script because people's lives are at risk. I'm going to just make a tiny little side segue here, and that is that some of the first bands of Florence may come into the area that both Candace, Kaiser, and I, who are on the phone, are in. So if we lose connectivity, thank you, Bill Baker, our moderator on this call today. We'll make sure that the slide deck is still available and moves forward. But we are in the Carolinas, and we will keep you posted on that next week in our newsletter. So please do opt into that. So we've talked about why we message map. We've talked about how to identify stakeholders. We've talked about how critically important it is because every crisis is a human crisis and lives matter. So now let's talk about the medium. How do we get those messages out? And do we even have to? Do you have some comment on what media is today as maybe compared to where, at least when you and I started our careers, how we communicated?
It is so dramatically different. The only way to get out mass messaging at the time when I started in this business was really through the media. It was both seen as best practices and responsible in the field, and in some cases, depending upon the industry, whether you're regulated or not, was required to be used and put messaging out as a way to communicate with the public. Now, obviously, we have a variety of means that we can go directly to our audiences and communicate directly with them. It is not necessary for us to go through the media to do so. So, and in doing the direct communication, the media is open to find it because we can put it out on our public channels. So we have social media, we have our own direct web ability, we have our own text-based messaging systems that we can use. And of course, we have, what seems like old-fashioned email and a variety of other ways that we can communicate directly with the audiences and in the way that they need to be told, with the information that they need to be told. The media is still out there, and there are many ways that we may want to communicate with them, and in time it may be appropriate, but at the same time, it cannot be the driver of when we communicate, how we communicate, and to whom we communicate.
Kathie, I think we should make the point too. I've told you a story before about how lack of communication to public officials during an evacuation at a campus in Louisiana that was downtown created significant gridlock in the downtown area and put many, many people's lives at risk had there indeed been a true bomb threat. But you and I both worked in a fairly good-sized city in the middle of Ohio at one time, and there was a huge insurance company there, and the state itself employed thousands of people. So if there was an emergency, an ice storm or some other type of an emergency, when people were evacuated from the downtown area, it had to be done in a very thoughtful way so as not to create a secondary crisis that significantly could impact the safety of people as they were all trying to leave at one time. You were in charge of some of those communications yourself. How do you go about making sure that you're getting those messages out completely? And I know it's much easier today. Even when it comes to load testing your website to make sure the website doesn't crash when everybody comes there for messaging, how do you advise people going out making sure that they're using all of these different media to their best advantage?
So that's a great point. And depending upon the industry or the location of your particular company, or maybe several locations, you may have some very large facilities that house a number of people in some small towns. That is going to have an impact on who you communicate with. 9/11 was such a tragedy, but out of every tragedy, if we're smart, we can make good happen. And one of the things that happened in some of the communities in which I work was that the community leaders got together with the business leaders to begin strategizing and planning to handle the eventual response to any type of particular crisis. So to minimize the secondary impact on people, whether or not they get caught in traffic, whether or not they are exposed to some sort of an agent if they are unable to evacuate properly. And so making sure that that if you're in a particular area, who the spokespersons are, who the key contacts are for all of the local government and regulatory agencies in your area, as well as making sure that they know who you are and how to get in contact with you at any time, is vitally important. Those relationships will pay dividends later on when the eventual, no matter what scale of event happens.
And you made a point earlier when we started about knowing who's preparing these messages. And many companies will just go to marketing and say, hey, marketing, you do this, or human resources. Hey, human resources, this is to employees, you do this. And that may often be incorrectly assigned, or it needs to be assigned as a collective team. We talk about that a little bit here because when your brand is being communicated, when you're communicating a message that is critically important to your audience via your Twitter channel or via Facebook or Instagram, and you are clear on the message, you're clear on the goal of the process, but then you have the materials or the messaging created by a marketing team that does what marketing does. Marketing is there to make a message to promote sales, to promote engagement, to promote excitement around a brand, and that may not be at all what we want to communicate during a crisis. So we need to work with our marketing and communications teams to make sure we have a separate set of documents or look and feel of communication for when there is indeed a crisis message that has to go out. And along with that messaging, we need to make sure we are clear and lined up with the mission of our organization's philosophy and strategy on risk based on our corporate culture, our clearly articulated internal and external communication policy, and again, asking the why we communicate. I want to talk a little bit here. We're going to talk on these next couple of slides about something that I think is confusing to people and is part of building a more mature program, and that's really what we want to get to. So can you talk a little bit to this slide, Kathie? And the next one, as I move forward, we're going to talk a little bit about transparency and what that actually means.
So trust and truth are two vitally important commodities that are not easily attainable and can be easily destroyed. And so we're going to talk about trust first. We sort of think we all know what trust means, but I doubt that many of us have really pulled apart all of the components to trust. Trust does not necessarily mean consistency. It does not necessarily mean reliability. It may mean consistency and reliability, but it also may mean alignment with other people's values, with customers' ideals. And so building and maintaining trust and in the case when we have to restore trust is something that we need to understand. And what does that mean to each of our audiences? Because our employees have one level of expectation and one level of trust in leadership, while consumers or community members have a very different expectation. And so this exercise sort of forces us to think through all of those different audiences, how we are building and maintaining, and therefore how that trust could be impacted by any of the potential events that we're considering. Truth is a very well talked about concept right now in the traditional media and through a lot of channels. What is truth? Is it knowable? Is it different between one person and another person's truth? While those concepts can be debated, when we're talking in a crisis, when we're talking about truth, we're talking about facts. We're talking about information and facts that are both knowable and verifiable. So when we want to put out truth, we don't necessarily want to put out everything we know, because everything we know, especially as a crisis is unfolding, may or may not be reliable. It may or may not be accurate. And so we want to let people know that we can tell you these 3 facts now. We will update you as necessary as we have more information, and be very clear about what is truth as best as we can know it, because at the end of the day, going back and having to explain what we meant to say does nothing but further erode trust in our organization.
And then we get down to what is transparency? Is it complete disclosure? And do we understand how to be transparent with our audiences? By creating these maps ahead of time, we get to have that conversation. We don't want to have that conversation when the earthquake is happening. We don't want to have that conversation after an incident of workplace violence or an accident. We want to have those conversations when we have the leisure and ability to explore the concepts and understand specifically how they relate to our mature communication organizations. Kathie, you've given us 3 key points that you want to make sure we cover. Can you talk a little bit about this for us?
Yeah, so message mapping is like an insurance plan. You don't want to use it. Any of us don't want to access our insurance, but it's irresponsible not to have it. If our primary responsibility is to our organization, to protect our organization, to protect our individuals working in the organization, then we cannot consider message planning or crisis planning as a luxury or something that we'll get to once a year or something that we'll put on the agenda. It needs to be something that we are considering and acting on as regularly as is reasonable and practicable. So then that leads us to number 2, which is prioritized planning. Obviously, you don't have the time to invest in in-depth crisis planning and speculation all day long or once a week. But you do need to regularly visit and revisit what your most, and I give you the number of 5, it could be 3, it could be 10, but the 5 most likely potentials. You've got to work those first, have those thoroughly developed, and then work your way down from there. If you have potential emerging threats that may be something that's on your horizon that you need to investigate, that's the time to identify them once you have your most obvious threats planned for. And then finally, message maps allow you to communicate very quickly on social and traditional media. Gathering banks of data and images and background material that you cannot spend time doing in the middle of a crisis is one thing that you can do here, where you can have that information stored on a readily accessible place for you to access and be able to provide that to your audiences as is necessary.
And you provided us this final note, a quote by author Alan Lycan. And can you tell us why this is important to you?
Yeah, so the idea that planning is bringing the future into the present, that's our job. I mean, our job is to foresee what could be happening in the future and to plan for it today. We are not a reactive group. If we allow ourselves to be reactive, we are not being properly as responsible or as protective as we can be in this particular area. And so bringing the future into the present allows us the luxury, the time, and the thought that will allow us to do something about it now, so that when and not if a crisis happens, we are already prepared and can hit the ground in a much more structured and responsible way.
Kathie, I have so enjoyed the conversation with you today. I've had the opportunity to have a couple conversations about this with you, and I hope our audience has really enjoyed your speaking. If you would like Kathie to answer any of your questions, either personally via email or in our fact document, again, please email any comments or questions or observations that you have to webinars@firestorm.com. They'll come directly to my attention, and I'll make sure that we get those taken care of and included in our brief. You can download any of our resources on our website. You can always contact us at firestorm.com, and we will make sure to help you through a self-guided assessment if you'd like to get started, or if you need to understand the components of how you create your own organization's crisis communication plan. And as always, we'd love to see you next month on our session, so please do register for that. We've got a great an infographic called Communicating During a Crisis on our website at firestorm.com. You can search for infograph, and all of our infographics will come up. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Fleck, for joining us today. And do you have any closing comments for our audience? We've gone a little bit over, but I think your closing comments are important enough to continue on.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Karen, and I want to thank all of you on the webinar for listening and taking the time to pay attention to this important concept. This really is for you, for your benefit, and to give you the tools and resources necessary to help your organizations not only survive a crisis, but be able to come out of a crisis even stronger. So I hope you'll take advantage of all the free resources that you have available through Firestorm.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being one of those great resources. Thank you to Bill Baker, who's our moderator on the call today, for standing by in case Hurricane Florence came in more quickly than we had thought. Candace, thank you for being on as well and for introducing Dr. Fleck to Firestorm. And we look forward to talking to everyone next month on our next session. Have any questions, reach out to us at webinars@firestorm.com. And thank you for staying with us for our extra few minutes today. This will conclude our session. Thank you again. Have a great day and goodbye.